These are our first year Masters of Public Art Studies students who come from a range of backgrounds in the humanities, from various contexts, and they are studying a range of discourses dealing with the question of the public sphere in relation to art practices in public space, and everything in between. As I mentioned to you recently, our first guest this term was Andrea Fraser, a couple of weeks ago, who spoke of her projects dealing with institutional critique and museology. Last Monday night we had a panel discussion with Ann Pasternak and Peter Zellner and Doug Aiken talking about their various perspectives. And it's your turn. Let me just say this on both a kind of personal / intellectual level. I mean, you already have Norman's bio. I'm not going to do a formal introduction because we're not really in a...
Yeah, we're just hanging out, right?
We're hanging out, but Norman is a professor at CalArts and has taught at various institutions in Los Angeles and internationally. On a personal and / intellectual basis, his writings, I think I first encountered his writings in the History of Forgetting book in the 1990s, early in the 1990s, which was very influential for me and I think many other people from a range of...
New edition.
That's a new edition, yeah. From a, I think Norman is really, has been one of the most important cultural intellectuals out of Los Angeles over the past 20 years. His writing, I think, is rich, critical, subjective, and there are many other ways to characterize it. Postmodern, in the best possible sense.
While postmodernists were still here.
Well, okay, while it was still here, but in the best possible sense, in terms of écriture, kind of richly woven together discourse.
Another one.
There's another one.
The Vatican to Vegas.
Norman has had a very significant following in Los Angeles for the past 2 decades. He's done critical tours of Los Angeles, which he writes about in History of Forgetting and other contexts. And so I'm very pleased to have him here today to impart his knowledge and to have a discussion with you about a broad set of issues pertaining to Los Angeles as a city and other places as well. So Norman, thanks for being here, and a good beginning. Thank you.
All right. Have a meal afterward too, if you like that.
The what?
You suggested a meal afterward.
Yes.
Right. Since there's only a few of us, it seems to me, we should try to make this a way of talking together to make sense. So I'm actually answering what your needs are. There's a wide range of what I do. I write fiction. I build exhibitions of a kind. There's one running that just opened, but this is one. You read some of the History of Forgetting, I understand. And there's 4 pages in the History of Forgetting called the Unreliable Narrator. You saw that little section? It's a little section. That's not really buzzing, is it? I hate that. And you try to think whether it's arthritis or you, or some kind of alien landing on the roof or something like that. Anyway, this is a novel built around those 4 pages. And it's 1,100 images set in Los Angeles. It's called Bleeding Through. And so that means that and then it has a novella in the front, but it's an aporia, because it's that which can never start, so that it's not an introduction, it's something else. So this is the way it was working. So we could look at this if we choose, right? That's one choice. We can head into how do you use media to represent cities, and how do you use media to represent new forms of narrative, and what's the space between fact and fiction. The character in this piece was a woman who you meet. She's well in her 80s. She's like the ancient mariner by this time. You know, she just kind of like shuffles along. She's got, you know, the beaded purse, and she's got a wig, and her dates get very, very curious. She goes from the First World War to the Depression in the same year, and you know, things like that. But then you hear this rumor about her that she may have murdered her second husband, and she doesn't care. You can try any way you want. You know, go up to her house and say, "So what happened to your husband?" And she'll say something like, "Well, yeah. It's obvious, right? I'm old and they're dead, right?" And there seems to be no Dostoevsky clue. There's no noir affect. She just doesn't give a shit, you know. And so you build this story around the possibilities and impossibilities of this, and she has not a noir bone in her body particularly. She lives where all the great noir films were shot, practically around downtown. And so she's worked in places where people have been murdered in the movies constantly for generations. She likes comedy. She saw Gloria Swanson a few times. She likes that kind of stuff. And that's that. And so this is built in that way. So the place between fact and fiction is difficult to identify, because I located Molly's actual photo. I had to keep it out of the project. I was shocked that someone actually took a picture. The Molly was Molly, but isn't Molly, right? It's complicated, because the only way to really lie is with some facts, right? In other words, if I told you I'm going to only lie for the next 10 minutes, that wouldn't be a lie, would it? I mean, in a sense, he said he was going to lie, he lied, right? Yeah, it's rhetorical. It's a rhetorical issue. Anyway, so this object has traveled around, so that means I write books that are critical histories of, I suppose one could say, particularly built around collective memory and how unstable it is, and how that works in terms of politics and cities, and so on. So that's one direction I could easily go into, and I have a new edition for the book. And then there's also a second one, another one of these media novels that's running now. And that one's called The Imaginary 20th Century. And that'll be coming out. It's already shown in about 5 exhibitions, I guess. Some I'm not even sure if it was even exhibited. Apparently it was in Stockholm, I found out. The email arrived, or the thing arrived, and I don't know whether that means. It's so funny because it arrives on the internet. Does that mean it actually happened? I guess it did. but it's shown in Germany now for 2 years, and it was in Istanbul. Apparently it's going to Mexico City. There's something in Otis. And now the Imaginary 20th Century also has a series of images built around a story with holes. And I could explain why I work this way, if that's where we go. Right? I'm just going to talk about stuff I do, and then we'll get a feeling, right, as to which part of this would be more interesting rather than just trusting my narcissism, which you shouldn't, right? Because I'll get it wrong. Right? But in this story, it's set in 1893 to 1926, and apparently there is a legend or a rumor that developed in New York around after 1908. A woman shot a man, it didn't go to trial, and then this woman became something of a legend. Because she lived in part of Little Italy that later became Greenwich Village, so the legend just sort of evolved. But the woman herself, apparently in 1901, selected 4 men to seduce her, and had moved out here, actually, to Altadena, which was the capital of science imaginary in Southern California, because they were building airships, real airships up top of Mount Roll. And Thaddeus Lowe had been working 50 years to make airships that could blow up things. It was strange. And the view from Mount Lowe became the model for science fiction of the some extent. Now, she selects 4 men to seduce her. The rule is that they each have to talk about the future century. That's the Scheherazade reverse. And what happens to them and to her is more or less to contain her until 1925. Her legend, her rumor survived so well that it seems probable that she is the bride stripped heir that Duchamp uses for the Great Glass. Now, some of what I just said is true. So the line between fact and fiction is interesting to play with, particularly after an election like ours, right? So clearly, it also wound up being fact and fiction and money, right? Derivatives is fact and fiction. So all of these arguments coming from the postmodern era about what is or isn't actual and what is or isn't believable is so complex. We finally have actually crashed into the fact of our own fiction, right? And we're screwed. We have this one guy with a bullseye on his head, and everyone's trying to figure out whether they can hit him this year or next year, figuratively, I hope, you know. But it's a very dangerous and weird moment. Culturally, it can be fantastic. You are in such a strange era. You can't believe historically what the implications of this era could be culturally. It's a very, very powerful possibility. No money, but very powerful possibility. Almost every culture that has faced a shock like this, from superpower and then feeling its dust on the tongue, almost every one of these cultures, that would include Spain in the 17th century, France in the 1870s and afterward, England in the 19s, Germany obviously in the 20s, Rome in the age of Apuleius in 170 AD. You go on and on. Italy in the 16th century, watching the Atlantic resources pulling out. Every one of them were screwed up. Every one of them had a wish for their own decay, and every one of them experienced the cultural golden age. That's a kind of a relief.
Would we know our cultural golden age if we saw it?
I'm not sure. There's every indication that often you don't. Because everyone claims it, right? I'm sure 3/4 of the people who come through to give lectures claim it, right? In some form.
Well, it's often claimed by institutional bodies, you know.
No, then they wouldn't know.
Well, but often they wouldn't know, but they often claim it.
Often is a very, very political thing. Very, very polite way to put it.
Yeah.
They almost have to claim it, or else they lose their job. This is the best.
Exactly.
This is this program. Are you kidding? Are you doubting me? Are you, you know? It's like Robert De Niro or something. His taxi driver. But of course, the other side is that Cervantes was the best-selling writer in the late 16th century, and he died essentially of poverty. Not just he died poor. He died of poverty, practically. Not a good sign, right? If the best-selling writer, right, in the early age of print, didn't make any money, right? How that happened is complicated, but so we understand that it's a trade-off. But yes, there is. Like if you look at France loses to Prussia in 1871, the French, of course, see this as the end of all. Napoleon was bad enough. Now those Prussians, the morons of Europe, the ones who didn't know what they were doing, the whole Napoleonic period, actually destroyed France in 5 weeks. And so even though the French economy was not doing that much worse than anyone else, the state of mind was that we're finished, right? We're over. We're gone, right? We're history. Now, you can everyone studied the moderns, right, from the 1870s to World War I. It's a religion. If you're in the arts, it's the closest thing we have to Catholicism, you know? It's the thing, it's high mass, right? And we know that there was tremendous self-consciousness about it, so that one could say there's an argument on one side, right? Mm-hmm. But it's hard to say whether the other examples, Spain in the 17th century was spiraling like a rock down a well. They didn't quite notice that they were inventing the novel itself, and they were inventing new directions in painting that would have such a profound influence, and it's very complicated. So it's interesting, definitely. So that's one direction, right? To talk about this fact and fiction, and what does it mean now that we've actually hit this wall that looked imaginary, and it turns out it may have been imaginary, but it cost us $4 trillion, right? Mm-hmm. It's the most expensive imaginary wall in human history, right?
Can I read something to you that your own words?
Yes, please.
You say in the I think it's in the introduction to History of
Yes.
Forgetting, you write, the social imaginary, therefore, is a built environment that also contains an evacuation. It is charming because in part it erases. That missing part induces suspense. In lectures to students, I always summarize the social imaginary in a phrase, quote, you're quoting yourself, I believe, a collective memory of an event or place that never occurred but is built anyway, end quote.
Yes. That was in my notes. So now I saw
sorry, all right.
No, now I'm getting a direction. Right?
Okay.
We're working together, but I think if it's a smaller group, I can be more associated, right? Mm-hmm. And yes, the term social imaginary has roots in France in the 1960s and the early 70s. Castoriadis and Lacan and Foucault all have variations around this problem. What events do people collectively remember, and what if someone acts upon it? The easiest example of social imaginary would be, let's say, Venice, California, because it's supposed to look like Venice. And they even had gondoliers they rode over, put sombreros on them. And it turns out, I did some research, there are at least 25 to 30 other Venices that were built. They built a Venice in Chicago, in St. Louis, in Vienna, in London. We know they built one in Vegas, right? And Coney Island modeled itself probably on the copies of Venice. Why Venice? I don't know. So then I went to study why Venice, right? They even had a traveling Venice you could put in rooms. And then in Victorian England, you could just see 16,000 little buildings, and you just put them and look at them. It's very strange. Why Venice? And the Venetians don't know either.
Can I ask you a question?
So that's a social imaginary.
That's a social imaginary.
But that's an easy example. Then the subtler ones are more interesting, don't you think?
But isn't Venice itself, that is Venice, Italy, in and of itself, social imaginary, as much as it is a built environment? I mean, so if it's...
Yes, I understand. It's very strange. I mean, let's even think of an example a little bit closer to our experience now. Obama gets elected president. The world goes... no president has brought people to tears around the world. I mean, not just the national holidays in Africa, but everywhere. It was unbelievable. So what was it? Because people weren't congratulating him for changing America. No, it was the imaginary America. For 500 years, there's been an imaginary America, and we need it. All wildernesses that attract us somehow feel like America. People go to America, come back, send you money, right? And there's some kind of imaginary America that exists in Uzbekistan, it exists in Ukraine, it exists in Istanbul. I mean, we could go over the examples. I'm sure if we go back and forth, we'll see that there are many of them. So apparently, Obama isn't the president of the United States. He gave the world back this imaginary America, like an old uncle who always stays in the back of the room, right? Because he has to be near the men's room because he's that old, you know what I mean? And we like America, we like this imaginary America. So you could say the social imaginary of America, but then you say, wait a second, maybe that'll help him diplomatically, right? Maybe that'll help tourism, maybe that'll give him some other momentum, you know, and the crowds will love him. Is that social imaginary a real thing? Yes, right? Is it an imaginary thing? Absolutely. I mean, Kafka wrote a novel called America. He didn't even want to think of America. This went ahead. So we live in a place that has generated as many social imaginaries that go out there as any place one can think of. America itself has this very, very weird echo that doesn't even have to do with the United States exactly, I think. And Obama has somehow restored that to the world, even if he can't get one Republican vote, I think he does. Now you could also say the future is a social imaginary, because that's the only way you can operate. You could say that you go to a therapist for 2 years, you feel much better, everything's wonderful, you know, your relationships, your finances, you're looking better, you lost 20 pounds, 40 pounds, you're exercising, and then you read that this therapist was just arrested. Complete fraud, right? But the person wasn't a complete fraud, right? Because you feel great. I mean, so there's a clinical imaginary. One could say Freud's model of the mind as the beginning of this topology of the unconscious was not really there. You know, it looked more like a Viennese block of rooms or something. like the pre-conscious and the boiler. And so you can almost see it as architecture from Vienna, you know. But at the same time, the operational meaning of it, right? Freud as a novelist for treatment, it's interesting how powerful it is. So the social imaginary can also be issues of race, right? Obviously, racism is a social imaginary also, presumptions. And then also it's branding. I mean, I teach at Cal Arts, but I also teach at art centers some classes, and I see branders.
You see what?
People who brand.
Brand. Oh.
Yeah, they hire you to brand. They hire you to invent an image of something that's not true. It's actually just a petrochemical distillate, but it sort of tastes a little bit like butter. And when you mix it with something left over from old radial tires and, you know, various plastics and put in some chocolate on it, it's quite tasty. Now you have to brand it, you know, and to make people's mouth water when they wheel across the aisle in bonds, right? So, oh my God, I need one of those colors in my body. I need this thing, this you know, petrochemical candy or whatever it is, right? And so it's strange, right? The branding of things, and so it goes on and on. The social imaginary was a lot of fun to play with in that project. It worked very well for Los Angeles because LA has a history of promoting and boosting itself from the 1890s on. So it worked so easily for this one particular case, the city, and it's still there. And I'm sure that your program, like any other program that deals with public culture, is right in the middle of it all the time. Because for a time there, we even going to call the Cultural Affairs Department, rename it Cultural Tourism. I went to a meeting about this.
In terms of social media,
am I doing all right? I know, yes, I have notes, but I think if we have enough time, you know, and I show you enough, we will get from A to D, right?
And some images, right?
And oh yeah, about 3,500 to choose from, so we'll be all right. It's absolutely, yes.
in terms of social imaginary, is there a difference between collective memory and collective forgetting?
Well, I think that all memory is a form of forgetting. I mean, or put it this way, if someone says, oh, I remember where my keys are, that's sort of like, so what, right? And if I say, oh, I forgot where my keys are, that's also not interesting. But when someone does this, they go like this, where are my keys? That's interesting. Right? I mean, when people make a selection, what if someone's been through a trauma, right, and decides how much to remember or not remember? That's interesting. So to some extent, by definition, memory personally and collectively has to be partial, selective, it's invaded. People in the arts are absolutely obsessed with it. Right? So for me, forgetting is interesting. Remembering is an interesting illusion. Because what do you remember? It's a map form of remembering. I call a map is of the unfindable. It's what you can't find, but in order to make the map work, you have to erase other things. You go through a map of Los Angeles, you don't meet anybody. You start meeting a lot of people, you can't map it. You know.
Can't you map either literally, symbolically, or somewhere in between the social imaginary? That's what you've done.
Yes.
Or that's what you're.
Well, that's the dream. Right? That's the dream. That's part of what the situationists, that's whom some of you have studied probably, were obsessed with, right? To make a cognitive map. Art tries to make cognitive mapping. We try to make something stronger than a memoir, stronger than just an echo, stronger than just our own personal memory. We try to make something that plays with the paradox of the question, like, isn't memory a form of forgetting? And of course it is. It's also obvious. But now you have a different job. You're not dentists, right? Oh, I remember you needed a root canal. No, that's different. No, we have to somehow make vision slow down. For example, when I take people on tours of Los Angeles, I call them anti-tours. And yeah, I've been asked to do it. People love these anti-tours. They love not finding things. The idea of an anti-tour is I show you what's missing. You get out of the truck, the van, or whatever it is, and we stand there and said, see, it's not there. And you think people are absolutely obsessed with this. It's not there. And they look for, and they see a little trace of it. Architects love that stuff because there is always a footprint left, right? What is or isn't, the ruin, the trace, and so on. So our job is to slow down memory. Is that a fair way to put it? To humanize alienation. And we're trying to find tricks, instruments, that work for this moment. And to somehow be able to move outside of ourselves enough, especially if you're dealing with public spaces. Because public spaces is just what you do when you're outside. I mean, how about this for an inversion? If it were 1900 and we were in a city and you wanted to hear what the sounds of the day were like, you have to leave your room. Am I correct? If you wanted to make arrangements with a friend, you had to leave our room. If you wanted to understand the news of the day, we had to leave our room. If you had to find out what was going on in the city itself, you had to leave our room. So far, everything I've said, we don't leave our room for any of that. It's only in our room. Right? I haven't yet mentioned anything we actually do outside anymore. It's extraordinary how many things. Go to a bookstore, we go on Amazon. It's on and on. So the whole idea of what is public and private has become tremendously inverted. Right before I left, I got this call from Germany. I'm going to do some sort of they call it a keynote, which I never understand what that means because you're never keying or noting anything. But they give, that's a name. I'm sure you've been asked a keynote, and at first you think it means something, then you find it means nothing. But you're schmoozing with them, right? And part of the obsession is, what does this inversion mean? Now that public and private have converted, what is a city if a city no longer does what it used to do? Does it dress the same way 3 times a day as it did? Does it mean anything? A city like Los Angeles, which never seemed to have very much of a public face compared to London or New York or Paris, obvious examples, or Asian cities where people literally live and eat and get massages on the street. It's this very, very intense public kind of city. We wonder, what do we mean by inside and outside, public and private? So we have that issue too, if that's your subject. If that's where you want to put your instruments and work on, you've got a very, very interesting moment, right? Really crazy. Not crazy, right? I mean, our public life seems to happen at home. Our privacy is out shopping when we're in some dream state. I mean, if someone walks up to you in the mall and says, "Hi, I just thought I'd say hi." You think, "Who are you, psychotic? Is your medication off? What? You don't have any? Did you lose your credit card? Are you talking to me in the cathedral space of a mall? Are you out of your mind? I'm not a teenager. I'm not a mall rat. Just, take a walk. This kind of thing." But in city streets, that would be considered more normative, right? It's like we have so much privacy that they're obsessed in Europe still with all these gated communities in the United States. This German was talking about that. And I said, well, they don't have to gate communities. They just have to make it impossible to have a park there. Gates. You just can never get there. By the time you read the sign, it's like an hour later, you don't know what to do. You just leave. If you're here this hour and this hour, this kind of thing, and we have armed response, and we have, werewolves out in the full moon. You just read the thing and you can't. So I don't know what the hell. It's like a gate, right? It's fine. But what does that mean about public and private life? And the general attitude has been we need to put more pedestrian reality onto the streets. But now people are thinking, wait a second, when you're walking like a zombie, right? You don't want to communicate with anyone, and you're just looking for the best pizza, right? Or the best Thai dinner. What is that, urban life? I mean, what is public culture in a world like ours? And then the final spin?
Well, wait a minute. Norman, what is, from your perspective, urban life in relation to public culture?
For me,
is there a model that exists somewhere?
Historically, there are 2 versions that have dominated the theory, right? Version A was urban life was always about the boulevards. which basically, in a way, were like malls, even though they were on big streets. And number two, urban life was about the neighborhoods. I'm a neighborhood guy. I think urban life is very local and not cosmopolitan. I love the local feeling. I mean, and so for me, urban life is in a strange way not urban, you could say. I can see someone say, Norman, that's so stupid. You mean we're all the Salvadoran peasants get together and make a neighborhood? That's urban for you, right? Yes. Yes. So I think urban is a very, very tricky definition. In our myth, urban was cosmopolitan. The myth is that urban was the cosmopolitan mix of many people together. I think Louis Sullivan called it democratic ways, or Baudelaire said to mix my loneliness with crowds of people, right? And I sort of like that too, but I love the intimacy of an urban space. To me, a city is very intimate, right? That's just me. I wouldn't argue for it.
Is it possible for cosmopolitanism in a particular way to be manifest within localized situations?
Yes, I think
in terms
so.
of density, for example.
That's the myth. Okay, now let's go with the myth, and let's decide whether it's social imaginary or not. Fair enough, right? The most famous myth for people in the arts is the myth of the Bohemian, right? That artists had this community that was extremely cosmopolitan, and world-class artists would just hang out at bars. They would trade hashish together, trade wives, trade husbands, trade whatever. Alma Mahler was sort of, I don't know, going through every famous man one after the other. All these myths they're funny, they're ironic. We think that that's something special, right? And the word Bohemia originally comes from the French word for gypsy. It had to do with neighborhoods that were very transient, because artists don't often make solid investments in the early parts of their career. The arts also wasn't in the university world, so it was very hit and miss. It came and went, and this and that. So the idea, that would be an example of urban cosmopolitan, I guess. Now another notion is, if you look at Los Angeles, in the new edition of History of Forgetting, I updated some of what had happened since 95, 96 when I finished the book. And I noticed something strange had come into being in the last 12 years. That if you start from, let's say, Koreatown, maybe even toward Crenshaw, you might go as far as toward Crenshaw, right? And go all the way up to, let's say, Eagle Rock. Does that make sense? You know that going up, and then you catch part of the Armenian Glendale, and then you make a turn and swing toward the western part of San Gabriel Valley. You go down past East LA. You have a chunk about 1.2 or 1.3 million people. It's demographically the most mixed place almost on Earth. In theory, that area, which pretty much includes here too, right, is the most cosmopolitan place on Earth, because it's got the largest mix of different ethnographies. Does it feel that way to you? Because it doesn't feel that way to me, really. But I love the idea of it. Except, you know, all the great $5 lunches you can get. I mean, and the fact that there are all these Chinese bookstores, or that if you go out, you can have amazing Taiwanese massages. My love loves these $15, $25 massages by these, you know, incredible Taiwanese masters. And she finally schlepped me out there. I found exactly one of those things. I was popping my fingers, and at least it wasn't walking on my back or something like that. But, you know, I mean, I'm just impatient, you know, I don't get it. But I understand that to many people this is that. And this whole area also, outside of, if you include some of downtown and areas around it, there's probably about 100 galleries that have opened in the general area. And they're small, some of them are just places where people live. In theory, one could argue that we are in the midst of an incredible cosmopolitan experience. So I leave you to decide, is this urban? Because on paper, right, it looks, I call it the new Byzantium, the new crossroads. More continents crisscross in this space than practically anywhere else, certainly in the West. And so here we are, right? I don't feel very cosmopolitan particularly. living here. But on paper, we are, though. The world thinks we are that way. As you know, right? They're quite convinced that this is it. We're here. It's pretty funny for us to stare at each other. We're both smirking because.
Well, I was actually thinking about when you're talking about what constitutes, well, what does constitute urban? I mean, you utilize the word disurban, I believe.
Well,
maybe you can talk a little bit.
Well, part of the problem that happened. I mean, I know you do a lot of work on on the city here also. Is that our definitions of cities come from no later than about 1910 or 20. We tried the word exurban, but it didn't really work, right? Because it just didn't. It seemed too strange, right? Postmodern geography. I don't know. Edward Sozier. I get the point, but we seem to be short a few terms to explain the overlapping issues. For example, in the midst of the so-called cosmopolitan, ethnographically, profound area, the downtown area is. They were hoping until the last crash to turn it into a suburb. That was their dream. To turn it into a bedroom community. They're even thinking of taking all the manufacturing zoning out of downtown to make it truly urban. See, to me, manufacturing in the city is urban. I'm from Brooklyn. Everything used to smell like a dry cleaning store. Whatever you want. Now it smells to me like a buttered croissant or something like that. I mean, everything looks like West Hollywood. Neighborhoods, I used to run for my life with my hands in my pockets, getting Yana Schimmel's knishes or something, And I was walking with my son telling him how heroic I used to feel, and a little blonde baby waved to me in front of Yana Schimmel's, knishes. It was just like being in West Hollywood or, on Santa Monica. So it's peculiar. In order to make it more urban and revitalized, it looks much more suburbanized than many cities. And they were trying to do that to Los Angeles, and I think they failed because they overbuilt and they didn't build enough. You're agreeing with me, right? There's not even, I think downtown LA is crashing.
Yeah, well, I mean, just seems, I've seen the changes in downtown and LA, and it seems like the big emphasis is on development within even policies, and there's a tension between the development and people moving in and the immigrants that are here, or people. I mean, because I think there is a pedestrian life,
unquestionably,
but there's
odd.
tension because what they're doing is illegal, and so there's a lot of those.
Yes, and they've been trying to de-Hispanicize and de-Chinese or Sinify, whatever you want to call them, downtown Los Angeles since the 1930s. There have been campaigns, certainly since World War II, and certainly that was part of how the freeways were built, and that's partly why they tore down so much of it downtown. It just was too damn Mexican, right? And they didn't want people to get out of the train station and see so many Chinese people. Which is so ironic now because we're desperate for Chinese to just keep giving us money. And also the manufacturing downtown comes out of the port, a lot of it, which of course was dominated by Asian container ships, particularly from China somewhere. So it's so complicated to play with what urban is. I love the contradictions. So maybe the working definition for our moment here tonight could be urban is the paradox of not knowing what urban is, right? In a relatively dense environment. And where the contradictions are at least acted out, and you can actually see them culturally, in place. You can see the contradictions, and hopefully there's also some cultural work that's responding to it. I'd rather leave it fluid like that, because this moment is this is a colossus. This isn't a tsunami. There must be a bigger word, in Japanese or something. This is bigger than a tsunami. This is it, I don't know, maybe this is how the dinosaurs would change, This is very big. This is beyond big. It's gigantic times 1,000. And so because it's transformative, it will transform,
What is the this that you're referring to?
I think the economic shift and the sociological shift and the power shifts that will come out of this next 10 years are going to be as large as between the 20s and the mid-40s. So that
Without a world war?
yes. Well, that's an interesting question.
I'm just wondering
Yes.
because that...
Yes, I mean, that's the weird part. I think it may be as large as that without a world war. It's very big. And I don't know how it will play out. And it'll take at least... I have a book, I've brought some notes that I've used for the book. It's called The History of the Present I'm going to be working on. And when I signed it, this crash hadn't happened yet. Now it's really a strange book, because the present has just stopped, you know. I have this other book, The History of Special Effects Environments and Cities, Vatican to Vegas. There a key term is scripted spaces, staged environments, where you have the illusion of power, but actually you know that you have no power, you know. And the casino being the obvious case, right? You pretend that you can lose slowly, but you know that you're going to lose. But you have the illusion of victory, and they give you this sense of being cosmopolitan in the middle of truly nowhere, right? But then it's, of course, somewhere. So all this is shifted. So I'm trying to really gauge this. The book is doing about a year, so I'm going to have to interview people. I'll interview you too. I'll see what you think.
Oh, shucks. You don't have. That's nice.
No, I want to. I want to interview everybody.
I mean,
No, I didn't mean oh shucks. I'm not saying
again,
anything.
it's... But if one, I mean, because in your, in the new edition of History Forgetting and the Future Forgetting...
Yes. Oh, you saw that, yeah.
Well, we've read it and...
Oh, you read it? I didn't know.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah, well, I wanted to just read something to you quickly.
Yes.
If that's okay.
No, that's fine. I didn't realize you
Just
had
as I
that.
was reading from the History Forgetting, I'm reading from the updated version.
Yes,
You're
correct.
reflecting on change.
Which is still written in July. Look how old it is already.
Well, you said raw facts are easy to lay out. Cities must turn into destination resorts like Vegas by the sea. There, residents and visitors play at being rich tourists. The, quote, general public, end quote, that is, those with less money are invited as well. They can play at carnival, visit the town castle for a few hours. Is the smell of rich people's money democratic or feudalistic? At many of these super malls, including the Beverly Center, cheap steam tray Chinese takeout faces glitzy shops that you might find along the Corso in Rome. The two extremes meet at play, but the play is solitary. A walk-through story where each shopper can pretend to be a main character. Is that democratic then? It would not seem so. Meta-urbanism replaces class conflict with theater. These outdoor theaters, scripted spaces, in parenthetical,
Yes.
invite the visitor to play at being rich. They reify much more aristocratic, isolated culture. Increasingly, downtowns monumentalize how little we need older definitions of public space, except as photo ops or movie sets.
Okay. What do you agree on?
Which is eloquent. Well, the question I have is, isn't it better to script historical spaces or to script or to generate this facsimile of cosmopolitanism than it is to script barbarian culture? I mean, that is to say, are these efforts in the most debased? Well, okay, but are these efforts? I'm not defending this.
No, I'm saying that part of the appeal of scripting things is to make barbarian culture more fun. You know, Indians, noir restaurants, you know, noir Gothic revivals. You know. Anyway, I interrupted you.
No, but yes, it certainly it covers up barbarianism,
Yeah,
but the underbelly.
Yes.
But it may be a lie and a facade and theater, but what's the alternative?
That's interesting.
I mean,
no, the reason why I present that question and why I think it's curious is that in the Baroque period they decided to reface a lot of Renaissance buildings. We think they are wonderful, don't we? Right? There was a lot of scripted, illusionistic environments. If Brunelleschi had truly understood the history of Rome properly, they would have walked around in togas for 300 years, right? There would have been no Renaissance. One can argue that what you said is a definition of all culture, right? All culture begins as ironic facsimile, right? As self-conscious facsimile, as facsimile dealing with the artificial, but it's not artificial. It's what I call artifice from the Baroque. It's the artful, handmade version, right? It's the interruption. It's the remaking of, right? And I could easily see that that's true. And I could think that within 30 or 40 years, people might walk through a lot of these facsimile garments and say, that's really culture, you know? I know that there are parts of Amsterdam that people think are very beautiful, but they're actually complete historicist facsimiles of the 17th century built in the 1880s. You know, one could easily argue and say, well, that's a piece of crap, you know. Why do you like a copy? Well, it turns out Baudrillard was wrong about one thing, unquestionably. It's not a copy without an original. It's when the copy becomes an original. Okay? And so, yes, it's possible that in this culture, you may, because what often happens is in boom periods, lots of facsimiles put up, right? Including the Rome of the Renaissance. I mean, if you stop for a moment, you can sort of see why Martin Luther was so pissed off. Right? What is this? This is God? This is what? This is what? This is Rome? This is ancient Rome? Give me a break, you know? And I could see that. However, then when the shockwaves of the religious wars grew worse by the middle of the 16th century, and then the Counter-Reformation began to really clamp down and it became more and more difficult as the century wore on. You could almost say, well, maybe then the facsimiles took on a patina, right? Mm-hmm. Couldn't one say that Victorian architecture is absolutely a facsimile? I mean, isn't Victorian architecture sort of pseudo-feudal? I mean, with little portholes that you could kill the mailman with a crossbow or something like that. You know, I mean, but we look at these and we're very charmed by them, right? So yeah, I would be. I'm not certain that the line is so easy to place between what is or isn't authentic. I went through Amsterdam. Now that I give anti-tours, everywhere I go, people give me an anti-tour. They show me their crazy. Okay.
No, I was thinking about Beijing during the Olympics.
Yeah, you were there?
No, but I used to live in Beijing.
Oh,
and
I need information. I don't know.
But they made a great effort to erect walls to cover certain buildings so that the tourists, this influx of visitors, wouldn't see some of the kind of ramshackle dwellings that were very common. And so I think this was a good example.
Yes. You've heard the expression Potemkin village?
Yeah.
It's a famous story. One of Catherine the Great's various cohorts, lovers, whatever, was in charge of making parts of the area of Moscow look better. So he built a fake village to hide all the mistakes. So it came to be called the Potemkin village. And there are stories about how parts of East Berlin, like Karl Marx Alley or stuff like that, have Potemkin village effects. So you were just watching a Beijing version of the Potemkin village, but it's obviously kind of ruthless and horrible because it lets things fester.
Right, it wasn't like the Dave Hickey that wrote about more people visiting the fake Grand Canyon in Vegas than actually visiting the Grand Canyon.
Could be. I mean, so the arguments are very, very peculiar. So my position, but I don't argue it because I think I have bad taste. I'm not past my taste. I think past my tools of instruments of thinking, right? I don't think. I think my social tools are whatever they are. But my feeling is I like to see from the neighborhoods out, so that I like to watch the Potemkin village. Some students are.
Wait a minute. I mean,
I like to see things from the back. I like to see malls from the loading docks.
But there's an indictment. But Norman, there's an indictment, a clear indictment within history of forgetting of the displacement and erasure of communities.
Yes. The modernist erasure was terrible.
That's a political.
Yes. No, I hated it. And when because I grew up in an area, I'm now going to do a history of forgetting for New York, Coney Island, and every building from the 8 years of my childhood that I was in Coney Island, every building is gone. Not just a few, the whole thing, the whole neighborhood's gone. So I hated the modernist, city of circulation.
Yes.
And And I watched the mistakes happening because I was living around downtown for all this time. And I'm now in Highland Park. It's still, within a spit of the whole problem. And because I couldn't afford Echo Park, I left Echo Park and then it was priced out. The house that I mentioned in that book, I sold it because I had to, because of my son's school. I couldn't find a school that wasn't insane for his needs. And then I sold it for $187, I remember distinctly, and it went up to $1.2 million. Almost as soon as I sold it, it was like, Norman's gone! Okay, wham! And then it was just, one time I was giving an anti-tour and some real estate brokers were following me, because apparently everything I was pointing out as being crippled with decay and confusion was a great investment. They tried to sell the class a fixer-up for only $500,000.
The entire class?
Yes, and the class was walking around, because it was a chance to walk inside a building that hadn't been fixed up yet, and then the class walked around and said, for $500,000, this can be yours. I mean, you probably come from families with money. If you're trained to be artists, you probably have money. And they were going through this whole thing, and I was sitting there. That
was their shtick.
Yeah. And it was pretty clever shtick, and the students were thinking, maybe I should call up my dad and, get this thing. Maybe this isn't it. And then I realized I have to put a new edition of the History of Forgetting, this is getting too far out of control, right? But it's very, very complicated. It's almost like this. You're in a poor neighborhood, right? The neighborhood's in transition, and then you feel sort of like you're in transition, right? And then suddenly it starts to look too bougie, right? Too disgusting. And then the cafes look wrong, and then you're not sure whether you like it as much. So that means you're part of the problem, right? But you don't like when it goes too far, right? Like Silver Lake or some other areas in LA, Manhattan's, Brooklyn, the film of these neighborhoods that transform. So I don't know how to make this judgment exactly. And now that a lot of these consumer-driven, scripted areas are going to really crash. There are parts of the situation in Vegas is dire. I think the real estate prices in Vegas are crashing faster than many other places. The port is frozen. There's practically nothing happening.
Which port? Down here?
Oh yeah, it's pretty bad apparently. I don't know how bad, but they say it's pretty bad. I'm going to go down there and find out.
Oh, please.
So in other words, even what we're talking about is interesting. So I love the irony of it, right? But I guess I really do. My heart is in the neighborhood. I'm a neighborhood kid the way I see cities.
Could you elaborate?
Am I doing okay for this? Please interrupt.
Could you elaborate a little bit more, please, about the distinction that you see between an area like Silver Lake, where obviously gentrification is, forcing some people to leave, and a forced displacement like Chavez Ravine?
Yes.
Because you do lay some of this out.
Absolutely. And there is still forced displacement. That was done through eminent domain, and it was part of a kind of mythic modernist city that was identified with circulation. If you want to look at the maddest way of describing that, you knew you were in a truly modern city if you could drive through it faster than you used to. It's kind of insane. And understand that it has something to do with the Haussmann plan in the late 19th century. However, they've done research and found out that by the 1880s and 90s, all the Haussmann boulevards were too damn slow. You couldn't cross them. You had to use the old feudal streets to get across a lot of Paris. So it didn't work. It was never about circulation, right? It was about power, right? And the immediate circulation, then within 5 or 10 years, it would crash. But there was no question that the selection process was ruthless. Even in 1939 in the New York World's Fair, they had this something called Futurama. I don't know if you've read about that or seen. Have you seen the films of it? They had a film Futurama. You can see it. And in it they say, we will get rid of blighted areas and replace them with good roads. What's a blighted area? That's what I talk about in the book, right? It's an area that's darker, right? Not wide enough. And so the whole process was so gruesome, and I watched it. So that's an easy shot. That's almost like, it's easy to say, don't tear down a neighborhood that has a personality, has a life of its own. But then the other examples, now they're somewhat, right? And harder to deal with, but I think overall, in any argument, I lean on the side of protecting neighborhoods. I say neighborhoods because I took the word community out of history forgetting. Every time I used it in lectures or in writing, no two people seemed to agree with what I was saying. So I actually went through a search and took it out at the time. Well, because I thought that
Community.
Yeah, I thought the word community.
Can you talk about that some more? So neighborhood, well,
that's why I'm using the word neighborhood. I know the word community would seem applicable as well, but every time I used the word community, I felt this that everyone had some correct idea of what community was. But neighborhood, it was so easy. I said neighborhood, people understood it was, you know, an area of 30,000 or 20,000 people, and certain center piece that it was a kind of like a necklace with a certain class, but it survived through certain economic forces. It tended to be owner-occupied enough so that there would be people who owned the businesses who lived nearby. I mean, the urban sociologists have made it very easy for us to say this is a neighborhood, right? And that, in fact, the modernist meta-planning destroyed an enormous number of these neighborhoods and made it much harder for them to continue. And now there's this obsession over the last 20 years, as I'm sure we all know, to restore a feeling of the neighborhood. And one could even say that globalism brought the neighborhood back because it removed everything in between. There's the term globalized localism. That, in fact, what really was destroyed was the network of neighborhoods together, so then you were just locked into whatever you could drive within 5 minutes of your house. That was your neighborhood. So it's a very complicated thing, but my point of view is you start from the bottom up. You know, there's some people who work otherwise. I'm not arguing against it, you know, taking the other point of view. I just don't feel comfortable unless I see the neighborhood and the other.
But it's possible to have a neighborhood without a community, right?
Maybe. Sure,
I mean,
why not? I can see that. I mean, I mean, the issue of what a neighborhood... I lived in South Pasadena for a while and had a horrible time. I just never belonged there. It was like the land of no pepper. And but I know that as a community, South Pasadena is tight. You know what I mean? Really tight. Are you a church? Do you like oak trees? You know what I mean? It's a very clear thing. The ethos, the ideology, that they fought the state of California for almost 60 years to stop a road going through. It's the longest, most successful community struggle against the large sort of statewide forces in American history. So, on paper, right, this is a really great community. It was just nothing. I could never, I always felt, I mean, odd things kept happening, even at the bank and at the stores. And now I visit South Pass, you know, for shopping because I'm not with Highland Park, right? So it's okay for me to interlope, you know? And I don't mind it. So for me, South Pasadena was a neighborhood, quote, I couldn't stand, right? Because its community didn't seem to want to accept it. It's very crazy, right?
But I mean, would you suggest that that to think about community figuratively or materially would suggest, perhaps not, appropriately, that there is communication, that there is interpenetration between bodies and interests, and that's distinct from a neighborhood in which... That's the distinction that's often made. Yeah. That a community doesn't have to be contiguous in a certain area. It's shared purpose, shared mission, and being the son of a kosher butcher and having no connection to God except by helping him get customers. So, and being inside as tight an ethnographic community as you can imagine. I mean, concentration camp survivors. It was like living. When I first saw a Bruegel painting, it looked like my neighborhood. I remember my childhood looked like a Bruegel painting. When I went to Vienna, that they had heard me say that, so they took me to the Bruegel room. And flashback.
And I spent 2 hours walking through Bruegel paintings to try to figure out that it wasn't Brooklyn. I kept walking through until I could finally separate out. Because these old guys walking around pretending to be happy, or happy holidays, but they had to get back to the store before 8 o'clock in the morning, you know? and they were supposed to say, sing, but they would always say, oy vey vey, right? So, oy vey 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 vey. I mean, just such misery in their happiness. It was just so thick. I was living in a shtetl, so that was a community. And I would, but you know, I liked the neighborhood, I just hated the community, you know? I lived in Coney Island for a time, and I loved Coney Island, but when I lived above the butcher shop, you know, there was the Italian community who liked to beat up on the dorky Jewish kids, me, right? And then there was obviously a Jewish community and businessmen, and there were layers and overlapping communities of this and that, right? In Coney Island, apparently, I lived around the corner for 8 years of my life from Woody Guthrie's wife. Never met her. And I think someone from her group came to our house one time to talk to my sister, because my sister was a really good dancer. And my mother thought she didn't look Jewish enough and wouldn't let my sister see her again, right? They gave her a full scholarship to Martha Graham. And my sister just didn't feel at home with that, you know. And so I probably went to the same store to pick up my gun, think of as a more urban experience. It's fair to say that our culture delivers less of that, and that the obsession with pedestrian life isn't quite the same as what that may be. And it's possible people may be, in a way, more urban and more open on the internet than they are in the world. At the same time, the need to be in a physical connection with the world and to have something beautiful and tangible and tactile and surprising, and not have to plan to meet someone 6 months in advance, you know. Hello, you got, let's get together. He said, well, does May look okay to you? May? Can't we just hang out? He said, yeah, in May, you know.
But this also has to do, I would think, or imagine, so to speak,
yes.
with processes.
I'm going to show you some of the images what was torn down, because we have to start images while
we're going to, yeah, what I'm going to suggest in about a minute.
This is identical locations.
This is
This is Bunker Hill. This is.
What year is this calendar from?
1963, 1987. He was obsessed with identical locations. Yes, this is a very rare thing. You see how well I archive things. It's even
Who produced this?
His name was William Ray, Bill Ray. He was a fine photographer. He was obsessed with downtown LA, so he kept photographing exactly the change. So I mean, you can see why it was a very easy argument to say this is disgusting. But on the other hand, even this here, so we understand the truth of it, these were fairly cheap liquor stores where you brown bag stuff, you know. So you don't want to get any hits that they were like little cute guys, like Cuddle Sock Hollow in the movies, you know, like John Garfield's mother or something like that. There was urban distress, but that doesn't mean you should tear it down. Let's see, here's another. And these are identical locations. Just so you have some visual pictures to go with what you read. See if I have another one. Oh yeah, this is cute. They took down the whole hill, sort of circumcised it back here, so turned it into a kind of a bald spot. Around where Mocha is, actually. And so he was trying to figure out so he could look at, you know what I mean?
But that's what they do in hills. They just chop them off, basically, and then they develop on the hilltop.
It's happened. I mean, this is, Pacific Palisades was actually hilly and bumpy, but a lot of people from Kansas apparently wanted to flatten it, so they went to the extreme of making it all smooth, so it felt like Kansas. That's, you know, I mean, there are many, many stories. In other words, I guess those are the main ones that speak to the problem.
Well, what I'm going to suggest is that we take about, it's almost 7:30. Let's reconvene at 20 to 8, so about a little over 10-minute break at this point, and then
I can show some images.
When we come back in about 10 minutes, we'll show some stuff,
some
images.
There's so many things. I mean, I did have an argument that I was going to develop, but I like the idea that we moved where we moved, right? But I'll review quickly some of the things I might have covered, some of the other books I'm doing, and then show you something of my new projects and how I'm using some certain images to develop fiction.
So we'll reconvene in 10 minutes.